Good evening, everyone. So, I want to start off. I need to eat a little crow tonight. I'm kind of embarrassed, but I feel the need to confess before everybody. So, it's been established that I can be quite a funny guy, right? But sometimes my humor gets me in trouble when I say things and it comes back to bite me. So, you may not remember, but I think I mentioned it both Wednesday nights that I'm doing Titus, going to go through Titus, and that Mike's going to finish up with 1st and 2nd Timothy, and that I'm going to do Titus in 4 weeks. And I said, I'm sure it'll be 48 weeks for Mike to do 1st and 2nd Timothy. So it's gone a little slower than I thought. So I talked with Mike and I said, we kind of talked about 4 weeks. What if it goes 5? And he says, yeah, that'll be good. That's fine. That's no problem. I said, what if it goes 6? I felt kind of like Abraham doing business for Sodom and Gomorrah. If we can just find this many righteous people. So anyway, I've bargained for a maximum of 6 at this point, and I hope we get there. All right, Titus. We're in chapter 1, Mike. Third night. We're still in. Oh. All right, I feel confession is good for the soul, isn't it? Just to lay it out there. All right. So just a little bit of a recap as we've looked at Titus. We've talked about Titus, and 1st and 2nd Timothy are called the pastoral epistles. We've done a little bit of, we even did a survey the first night and said, hey, has anybody actually been through a study, gone through some of the epistles? And nobody could remember. And then actually we've found a group. We found one group that have said, actually, there's some ladies here that went through, was it 2nd Timothy? Right? 2nd Timothy. So we have had at least one study, one person, thank you, Lauren, so that has gone through that. But we were trying to find who has gone through a study like that. We thought, well, no, just those passages when we select elders sometimes we get in here. But all right, Titus chapter 1. So we've looked at verse 5 being a critical verse there. Verse 5 of chapter 1 where Paul says, for this reason I left you, meaning Titus and Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. And then last week we went through these characteristics of elders, these qualifications or characteristics. And we looked at verse 6, it talked about family, husband of one wife, having children who believe, not accused of dissipation or rebellion. And then it went into some negative comments. Here are some negative things that we don't want to be in leaders, all right? They must be above reproach. No, sorry, verse 7. Above reproach as God's stewards, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious. I love that word. Not fond of sordid gain. And then in verse 8, some positive things, but hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, just, devout, self-controlled. And we looked at that, and it's like we're talking about men of good character. This is what good leaders look like. They're men with good character. And then throwing that word devout, that they're devoted to God and the things of God. And then in verse 9, we talk about the sound doctrine and teaching. That he holds fast the faithful word, which is in accordance with the teaching, so that he will be able to exhort in sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict. So now we're picking up in verse 10. We've established what those leaders should look like. How will he pick leaders? This is what he looks for. And now we're going to get into a section that would kind of like almost raise the question, why do we need leaders? Okay, why can't the church just can they exist without leaders? Why do we need to appoint leaders? And we're going to find out here that one of the roles of leaders is to protect the church. Protect the church from troublemakers. And so Paul's going to mention that there are some troublemakers here, and we're going to get some identification of who these troublemakers are. So let's look in verse 10. It says, there are many, not just a few, there are many rebellious men, empty talkers and deceivers. So right off the bat, he starts talking about character. These troublemakers, their character can be identified too. Just like we can identify the character of leaders, we can also identify the character of troublemakers in this sense. So they were rebellious, they were stubborn or resistant, they were empty talkers. So the idea is that they said things, but there really was no substance to them. Today, we would use the terminology of feel good. That would be kind of the no substance. It's the feel good sermons or the feel good teaching, or we want to make people feel good. So they were empty talkers. And then this one, they were deceivers. They were deceivers. So the idea is they knew that what they're saying is not true. They know it's not true, but they were misleading the people. They were deceiving. And I was just thinking about, okay, I was trying to think about, like, where do we find deceivers today, just in our world? And I started thinking about the spam calls. We were actually talking about some of those the other day. And I was just thinking about those, and, a memory came up. My youngest daughter, when she was 20, living in Fort Worth, going to college, she called one time, and her voice was shaking. You could tell she was just on the verge of bawling, scared to death. And she had gotten this call from some person who got really gruff with her. And Dina and I talked about it. We can't remember what it was, but I don't know if it was a traffic thing or but anyway, he said, you can either pay now or we're coming to the house right now and you're going to be arrested. And I just remember her describing about how convincing he sounded, like he meant business. And so she called me because something didn't sound right, but she was scared to death. And of course I said, don't do that. And we started looking up things and found out, yeah, this is a hoax. And of course, none of us like deceivers. But when something happens like that to your child, I think about being pugnacious in that situation. So, it's deceivers. There's just, you talk about a bad character flaw. And so Paul says that's who they are. They're deceivers, they're misleaders. And he said, especially those of the circumcision. Well, who does that refer to? The Jews. All right? So it's the Jews. Now, many times when Paul's writing about the Jews, he would be talking about what might be referred to as the Judaizers. And these were the ones who were devout Jews. They were very serious about their faith. They became Christians, but it just bothered them for the Gentiles to become Christians and not be circumcised or not to follow some of the laws or ceremonies that they did. And so there were those who kept trying to put those on the Gentiles. These are not the same, this is not the same Jews here. So you remember we talked about that there were Jews on Crete, right? And what clue did we know, how did we know that besides history? Yes, okay. In Acts chapter 2, when all the apostles started speaking in tongues and different languages, and he was talking about all those who understood, and it mentioned those from Crete. So Cretans was the word used, that there were some there. So history actually does tell us that there was a sizable Jewish population there. They were they weren't devout Jews, but they were influenced by the Cretan culture there. And we're going to skip down just as a reminder. We talked about this the first week. And what is the Cretan culture? Well, let's look at verse 12. Paul said, one of themselves, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. And then I love what Paul says, this testimony is true. All right? It's kind of like, hey, they're right on here. So a little background to that. So what this is really referring to is a poet or a prophet, words kind of used there at that time, Epimenides from 500 BC. Did I say that with confidence? I know I'm following your deal. Just say it with confidence and everybody believes. That's how you say it. Epimenides. So he had first said that. They think maybe he was around 500 BC. So this was not a recent reputation. This is a reputation that had been passed down from centuries. And obviously, it's a generalization. That doesn't mean everybody from Crete was that way. It didn't mean that you were born and there was something in the air there that just made you that way. It was just easy. There was a culture there, and some people just fell into the culture. But it was a generalization that had a lot of truth there. So I was thinking about generalizations. So I just think of one, like Texans wear boots and cowboy hats, right? And they have horses, all right? We do have a lot of people who wear boots and cowboy hats and ride horses, but not everybody does. What are some other generalizations you think of?
All black folks eat watermelon.
And fried chicken. And is that true?
Well, I have a sister in Arizona. She's allergic to watermelon.
So definitely a generalization, right? Okay. Not true for everybody. All right. Is there another generalization? It's going to be hard to top that one, but.
She didn't like fried chicken.
Confession. All right.
I was going to say white men can't dance.
Wow. There are some, aren't there? Yes. But that's a pretty good generalization. Okay, good one. Or jump, right? White men can't jump. Yes. Okay, good. All right. I think we should move on. You get the point. I think point has been made here. So there's this generalization. And Paul is saying, listen, that influence, that tendency is still true today. And evidently it's kind of saying these people, they've grown up in these culture, and even the Jews have bought into it. They've become those type of people. How'd I move over there? They become the kind of rebellious, empty talkers and deceivers. All right, so we skipped to 12. Let's go back to verse 11 now. Verse 11, Paul's going to tell Titus what he and leaders must do. So he says, with these people, you need to reason with them. You need to see if they will tone it down. You need to work out a compromise with them. No, that's not what it says. What does it say? Silence them. You need to silence them. And actually, that same word that's translated silence here could also be used for gag. You need to gag them. They need to be gagged. They need to be quietened. They need to be shut up right now. You need to silence them. So we've talked about the character of them. So there's a character. They're rebellious, empty talkers. They're deceivers. So there's some damage. They've done some damage, these troublemakers. Verse 11 says, who must be silenced because they are upsetting whole families. They're upsetting families. So, there's some ideas about what they're talking about. One, they could be going from home to home and talking to families and doing their teaching there. But usually, because of a phrase that comes a little bit later here, more likely it was either part of the house churches that they came in and wanted some time, or that they somehow gathered a group at one house and they were doing some teaching. And because we find out that the damage is that they upset whole families, but here's their motivation. So they are upsetting whole families, teaching things they should not teach for the sake of sordid gain. Now, where have we heard that phrase in Titus? Yeah, right back up above. That was one of the negative characteristics. This is a characteristic that will not be part of a leader. It won't be part of who he is. Not fond of sordid gain in verse 7. So it's interesting that we have this issue here, and Paul lists this as one of the characteristics. Now, there's one similar in Timothy in the characteristics or qualifications of elders, leaders there, but it says something, not a lover of money. But this one talks right about not shamefully making a profit. And so it seems there's a correlation. There's a reason why he used this phrase for Titus, because there's a lot of that going on. And so their sordid gain, shameful profits, as we mentioned, they were deceiving people. They were deceivers, and this is how they made a profit. So because of that, they most likely would want a bigger audience. And so as it says, upsetting whole families. Again, we don't know if it was they came and asked for some time in the house church, or if they just had people meet together, but it probably was a group of those who were part of the church. So verse 13, let's skip 12 back down to 13. Paul said, this testimony is true. So for this reason, reprove them severely so that they may be sound in the faith. All right. Now this one takes a little bit of trying to figure out who Paul is talking about when he says they. Now when you see the word reprove, because of other things he said, reprove them severely. That word sounds kind of like scold, correct. Another word could be used is convict, would be another part of this word. But if we think of reprove them severely, we're thinking, oh, he's talking about the troublemakers, these people who are coming in and teaching things they shouldn't be teaching for the profit gain. But he has this phrase here, for this reason, reprove them severely so that they may be sound in the faith. Now, when you look back at verse 10, where it says they're rebellious, and then in verse 11, where it says they were teaching so that they could get shameful profit, they were making money, they don't seem like the kind of people who would just so easily correct them and go, oh, you're right, you're right. I'm going to have to find me a decent, honest job, and I'm going to follow the Lord. So it doesn't seem like that would be something that just correcting them would make them change. Now, we know it could, but typically what happened when Paul did something that cut off somebody's means of income? Stoned him, chased him out of town. You usually don't get oh, brother, I see what you're saying, and I am changing my life here today. I wonder when he talks about this, if he's saying, for this reason, reprove them severely so that they may be sound in the faith, if he's talking about the families who had been upset. Because these were followers, and Christ followers, and somebody had come in and stirred things up and upset them and confused them. And the idea here is like you need to come in, reprove them, which I said could be convict them severely or sharply. There's the idea that you need to do it quick. Don't let this thing fester. Get in and correct this now. This same word that was used for severely here could also be said sharply, and it was the idea of something done with just one blow of an axe. It's like, you got to kill something, take that axe, do it, chop it off right now. So, you know, sometimes there's things that demand a sense of urgency. We live out in the country at Greenwood, so I was trying to think, 17 or 18 years, we've only had one encounter with a rattlesnake. Others have a lot more stories. I worried about having that encounter with a rattlesnake. You know, my brother-in-law rents a place and has cattle. He has all these stories about repairing fences or grabbing a bale of hay, and a rattlesnake's right there. And I just thought, if that happened to me, what if I just fainted right there? I just thought, I don't know what I would do in that situation. And I often thought about, okay, think about what you would do. That's assuming I could, you know, keep my senses. So one early evening, we had the garage door opening, and I went out to feed the dogs. We had this big old dog food sack, except it was almost empty, so it had fallen over. So I picked up the sack, and I saw the tail and heard the rattle at the same time. And I know there was like, I don't know if we'd had somebody over, there were things in the garage. I can't remember anything except I hurdled everything beautifully. And I was out at the garage. And then I just had to sit there and gather myself. And I thought, okay, you got to get in there. It's going to get away and hide somewhere. And so I had to get something, and it was like, I got to do this quickly. I'm not just going to slowly do it, but I had to get something and chop its head off quickly. I mean, we got to get this done. The idea is you got to get in. This is urgent. This is an emergency. You got to take care of this. And that's the idea that Paul is giving to Titus. All right. Yes. Do what? Oh, I killed him. Oh, yeah, he crawled out. Yes, he crawled out of that, and so I got the snake. Yes. Now, here's the story that when I was telling people before they let me finish the story, they laughed. I think this was my family, particularly brother-in-law. So when I was telling the story, I said, I jumped over all these things, and I was outside, and I thought, I've got to take care of that. So I called Dina, which is true. I did. I wanted to keep an eye on the snake and where it was, and I needed her to go get something for me to cut its head off. So I watched the snake, and we got something, and yes, we killed it. Got rid of it. 3-footer. All right. Now I'm lost. Say that again. You want a 7th week out of that story for running and maybe screaming on the way out, or for going back in? Oh, that might be true. Oh, this is going to be too many stories. My son loved baseball. He could hit the ball. He could field. He was Defensive Player of the Year one year for his district. But the boy was slow as a turtle. Except for the time we were out doing trash as a service project, and he went down to pick up trash, and a rabbit shot out of this brush. I've never seen that boy move. If we could have somehow harnessed that, he could have been a good college player, I think. But yes, so maybe you're right, Dina. I probably did dance that time. Well, all right. Again, I'm lost. Okay, here we go. For this reason, reprove them severely, so that they may be sound in the faith. So I'm going to give to you that I believe that we're talking about those people, those families who were Christ followers who'd been upset, and they needed to be come in and taught the truth quickly as well. Not paying attention, verse 14, not paying attention to Jewish myths and commandments of men who turn away from the truth. I just had a thought. This is a reason it's going slow. It's not me. They keep bringing up things. Yes, things like that. All right, not paying attention to Jewish myths and commandments of men. So in 1 Timothy 1:4, we have a very similar phrase where it's talked about the myths and genealogies here. So a little background, evidently there was some people at that time, and one of the things that they liked to do is they liked to take what was called the genealogies of Moses. They liked to turn that and they would insert like fake names. You know, there's fake news. These were like fake names inserted in here. And with these fake names, they would spin some stories. They'd make up some kind of story and some kind of fable about this. And then it says the commandments of men, they often would go, because of this, you should. So these guys were kind of fascinating. They were very good speakers. People would come and hear them. And so you could see why there was an attraction. They would tell new stories and new things, but it also upset some of the Christ followers there because of these things. So he's saying, don't have your people, don't let them pay attention to those Jewish myths and commandments of men who turn away from the truth. And then verse 15, Paul has this interesting statement, out of the blue it seems like. To the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure, but both their mind and their conscience are defiled. So I'm just going to kind of sum this verse up. You know, to those who pursue the will of God, those who love God and pursue God, to the pure, the things that they do with the good motivations, with love, with kindness and gentleness, they do things differently, whatever it is, than those who are unbelievers, defiled, selfish motivations, agendas. So for instance, if you see athletes who are Christ followers, do they not do things differently than those who are athletes and they're very self-centered? I mean, ask coaches which ones they would like in those situations. There's something different. What about politics? There's people who can go in with great motives, some Christ followers who want to do for the good of the people. There are also people who can go in and be easily manipulated for money or for favors or for some things. And so, you know, Paul is just saying for the pure, for those who pursue the will of God, those who love God, you're going to see that in their actions. But those who are not, you're going to notice those things as well. So when it comes to the Word of God, Christ followers, you're going to see their desire. Their lives are going to change. You're going to see some fruit. But those who aren't, you're going to notice that there's some things that aren't right. I mean, it's just a principle there. Somewhere down the line, their deeds are going to have to match their words. It's why character matters, because outside often reflects what's going on inside. And verse 16 follows up with that. So they profess to know God, but by their deeds they deny him, being detestable and disobedient and worthless for any good deed. Same thing. Character matters. Deeds must match their words. These people professed to know God, but there were some things that just didn't match up. There was something, and Paul is saying, look for that. Is that not also the reason why our leaders should have the characteristics that's mentioned in verses 6 through 9? So I think about a friend of mine who became a Christian. I just lose time. I've mentioned him before, but not by name. About 16 years ago, he was one of those guys that his wife became a Christian like that, and he took months before it happened. And when he became a Christian, it was kind of a slow growth. I mean, there was still some things that was hard to let go, and he was coming to church, and he was studying, and he was doing all that, but the fruit was slow in coming. But at one point, but another point in his walk, it started changing, and he started doing some big things. It first started out really getting involved and making comments and people noticing, and started to act. One time he was asked to do a brief talk before communion. It kind of blew everybody away, and it's like, wow, where did that depth come from? And it becomes to, in his business, hiring people who were either out of prison, out of drug rehabs or things like that. He was giving people second chances. What I'm saying is, here's a guy whose life was pretty rough. He and his wife were probably headed for divorce in a year or two, if not sooner. Things were really rocky. Today, he's still married. He has 3 kids. In his church, he wasn't nominated as an elder, but his name came up. So, I'm sorry. All right, so if you have children who are in the theater, they're ready to do their performance. So you want to make sure and take advantage of that and go see that, okay? So you will see that fruit. And that's what it is about these characteristics of leaders or elders. You should be able to see these things that have developed because of their devotion to God, because their love of God, their love of the Word, and the time they spent. Things start to happen. And Paul's just saying, deeds have to match the words. That's just what happens when someone comes in contact with the grace of God, with the sacrifice that Jesus did. That's what happens in people. We certainly see that in Paul, don't we? All right. Any comments before we move to chapter 2? We got to get a little bit in chapter 2. All right. Chapter 2. So we're finished up here in chapter 1. So he mentions, what do leaders look like? What do elders look like? And then he talks about the importance of leaders, and he gives the example of Crete. Listen, you got to protect the church because there are troublemakers. There just are. And leaders have to help protect the church from those who would get in and stir things up. So now we're going to get into chapter 2. And I don't know if I'll spoil things, but it would be like, I'm going to ask this question: what should church look like? What should the church look like? It's not a question asked here, but it would be a good title heading here. Mine says, Duties of the Older and Younger. Verse 1. But as for you, speak the things which are fitting for sound doctrine. Things which are fitting for sound doctrine. This is really interesting because it's our tendency when we think about doctrine that we start thinking, what is the information? What is the right information? What is the truth that we need to know? And Paul says here, the things which are fitting for sound doctrine. And another word for doctrine could be teaching. What are the things which are fitting for sound teaching? So it's interesting, after he says that, he's fixing to go in and talk about what a life should look like. It's like what's fitting for sound teaching is teaching people how they should live. Now, knowledge, having the right knowledge of who Christ is and what he did and what it means to be saved and how a person is saved, those are very important, don't get me wrong. And yet he says here, what I want you to teach is what is fitting for sound doctrine. And then he begins to go in and says, here's what that would look like. And so Paul's going to cover here just about every demographic. We're going to talk about the older men, the older women, the younger women, the younger men, the bond slaves. So Paul's going to talk to each one of them. We're going to get started here. We won't be able to finish, but we're going to get started about this, and we're going to kind of go through that. Then we're going to kind of back up and look at that and say, what's Paul saying here again to Titus? And which I also think to the leaders that Titus is going to select. All right, verse 2, we're going to start with the older men. Older men are to be temperate. We usually think of temperate as related to alcohol. That's not mentioned here. Probably the idea is just in all things, be quick to think and slow to react. As I was reading some things, I got the idea of don't be that guy that quickly jumps on a bandwagon, all right? Think about things and don't be fooled by things. Have temperance, all right? Does somebody have another word for the first one?
Level-headed.
Level-headed, okay, good one. Level-headed. Anybody else? Sober. All right. Is that the first one you have? Sober. Okay. All right. Then dignified. You know, dignified is worthy of respect. Your life shows one that people respect you. Does anybody else have a second for the second word? What? Grave. What else? Reverent. Okay. All right. Good. And then the third characteristic, sensible. Now that's where I was thinking sober-minded might be. What do you have for the third? Temperate. Okay. Funny. What version is that? King James. Okay. All right. Does anybody else have it for the different one? Sensible. Sober-minded. Yes. Okay. Yes. That's an NIV, isn't it? Oh, self-controlled. I'm sorry. All right. Self-controlled. All right. And then a phrase here that's all tied together: sound in faith, in love, and perseverance. Sound, another word might be healthy. It's like got a good grasp of faith, love, and perseverance. Now, that's interesting because in 1 Corinthians we have faith, love, and what? Hope. Yeah, faith, love, and hope. And here he says they are to be sound, have a good grasp of faith, of love, and perseverance. Now, would perseverance and hope be similar? Or maybe you can tell me, what would you see the difference in them? It's kind of what I think. DeWitt said hope is what keeps you persevering. Yeah, I kind of think what's the root of perseverance? Or I think some of you might have, does anybody have endurance? Is that word? Yeah, okay. You have endurance there? All right. Yeah. You have patience. Okay. Patience there. Steadfastness. Okay. So, I don't know. It's different, but it certainly could be the fruit of hope. I just thought it was interesting. Faith, love, and hope. We often think of that. Faith, love, and in perseverance. All right. Older women, real quickly. All right. Older women, likewise, are to be reverent in their behavior. Just kind of a demeanor that fits a Christ follower. It's something that people would say. There wouldn't be, the opposite would be, man, I see something in her. I wouldn't think that a Christian would do that. That would be the opposite. This is something as their behavior fits a follower of Christ. All right? Not malicious gossips. Not, okay. Does anybody have the word slanderous? Y'all have, what's that phrase? Just slanderous? Okay. Yeah. Sometimes gossip kind of sounds like, just chatty, not harmful. It's interesting that other ones translate this word slanderous. So the idea is, listen, gossip is talk about that hurts somebody. You know, it's things you share. They're usually not good. All right. So now I want to know this one. So interesting. What is the next one? Nor enslaved to much wine. How come they said that to the women and not the men? This is time for any good jokes you might have. I couldn't think of any, but seemed like a funny one. Too much time. They had too much time on their hands. The older women, just kids are gone.
Probably putting up with those older men.
Oh, that one backfired on me. Rats. All right. I thought surely somebody would have a good one. All right. And then it says, teaching what is good. Teaching what is good. And then we're going to stop here, but then it has so that, and it's going to talk about how they can teach young women and what young women who are Christ followers would look like. So we're going to pick up with that, and then we'll come back, and it's going to be good with young women. If you consider yourself a young woman, I just want you to know that of all the things that Paul mentioned for each group, the most things he gave was for the young women. Like, okay, you guys have a lot more to work on than the others. I had to get something in after Kay's remark. All right, let's pray. Father, we are continually overwhelmed and impressed by your desire for us to walk, and that our walk matches our profession and our talk. Father, I pray that you would help us see our inconsistencies. I pray that you increase our desire to please you, to be the type of people who make this world a better place, and also to be the type of people that others may look and wonder where our hope comes from. So, Father, as we look at these characteristics and as we look at the life of what our leaders and what the members should look like, I pray that you give us conviction and courage. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.